This is Babette, and I teach here at Fordham University in the philosophy department. And last November, at the end of November, I gave a webinar for Qualcomm, which was largely for nursing and public health professionals on qualitative methodology. And this lecture, which I'm about to give, the title is Methodology, Hermeneutics, and Science. This lecture is scheduled on Friday, which is when this should be shown, for the North Texas Philosophical Society, which is meeting at about 1 o'clock on Friday. So 1 o'clock in the afternoon, that's Central time, obviously, that's Texas time. And I will be presenting that here. There will be one or two sections, and I'll be introducing those as I go along. The title again, Methodology, Hermeneutics, Science, on Nietzsche's, and I'm quoting Nietzsche in the title, Triumph of Scientific Method over Science. And I'm going to read this first section here just as a brief aphorism, which is by Hobbes. Most men wander out of the way and fall into error for want of method, and that's Thomas Hobbes. And then again, it is the mark of an educated man to look for precision in each class of things just so far as the nature of the subject admits. It's evidently equally foolish to accept probable reasoning from a mathematician and to demand from a rhetorician scientific proofs, and that's famously Aristotle's distinction. The first section is entitled Choosing Science over Faith. At the juncture in his life in which Nietzsche loses his religion, as the 1991 R.E.M. song puts it, coming out, as we might say today, as a free thinker at the advanced age of 19, Nietzsche explains his reasons in a letter to his sister via this beautifully formulated hypothetical reflection. If you wish to strive for peace of soul and happiness, then believe. If you wish to be a disciple of truth, then inquire. This, it's important to note, Nietzsche's comment, Nietzsche's letter, is a dependent disjunction. Following, this illustrates the elegance of his style from the start, whereby the paths of humanity are split into two halves, a formula Nietzsche remains fond of. I'll give it to you in German. Hier scheiden sich nun die Wege der Menschen. Willst du Seelenruhe und Glück erstreben, nun so glaube. Willst du ein Junge der Wahrheit sein, so forsche. Seelenruhe und Glück erstreben. It's a very interesting reflection. That's just a repetition, so I'm going to go a little further. It's just the same point again, so just take a moment. And that's a letter that he writes in Bonn on the 11th of June, 1865. Here, Nietzsche explains the virtue of faith, whether religious or political or indeed scientific faith. Can we begin then that again? We're so close to the beginning, and that was too long a break. I stupidly repeated the German twice, so it's just
more to it, right?
No, but it just is the same thing again.
Oh, that's what.
Yeah.
So you want to repeat it from the beginning or from the German?
Yeah. So I think it's so close to the beginning. If we could just start again.
So wait, it goes.
You see, it's just a repetition. It's unfortunately a repetition. Seelenruhe, this Forscher is the ender, and then just go back down to that, because we had the first Forscher, and then stupidly, I don't know how that happened. That's just an accident of I must have hit the copy twice. I'm very sorry, but I think we're close enough to just start it clean again. This is Babette, and I teach here at Fordham University, and I am going to be presenting a lecture that was first given as a webinar. That means just broadcast, just the voice alone. A Qualcomm webinar for and on the theme of qualitative methodology. Most of the participants, and that was a worldwide webinar were nursing professionals and public health professionals interested in the question of qualitative methodologies. And that was the end of November 2017, and this will be the first time upcoming in Dallas, Texas, at the University of Dallas in Richardson, which will be a meeting of the North Texas Philosophical Society. And this is a plenary lecture, and it'll be broadcast then at about 1 o'clock in the afternoon on Friday. Title, and I have some subsections which I will be introducing separately: Methodology, Hermeneutics, Science, and there's a subtitle on Nietzsche's, I quote him, Triumph of Scientific Method over Science. And I'm going to begin with two aphorisms as mottos. First one from Thomas Hobbes: most men wander out of the way and fall into error for want of method. That's Hobbes. And the second motto: it is the mark of an educated man to look for precision in each class of things, just so far as the nature of the subject admits. It's evidently equally foolish to accept probable reasoning from a mathematician and to demand from a rhetorician scientific proofs. And that's Aristotle's famous distinction. The first section is entitled Choosing Science over Faith. At the juncture in his life in which Nietzsche loses his religion, as the 1991 R.E.M. song puts it, coming out, as we might say today, as a free thinker at the advanced age of 19, Nietzsche explains his reasons in a letter to his sister via this beautifully formulated hypothetical reflection, which I'll give in English first and then in German. If you wish to strive for peace of soul and happiness, then believe. If you wish to be a disciple of truth, then inquire. This, it's important to note, is a dependent disjunction. Following, this illustrates the elegance of Nietzsche's style from the start, whereby the paths of humanity are split in two, a formula Nietzsche remains fond of. In German: hier scheiden sich nun die Wege der Menschen. Willst du Seelenruhe in Glück erstreben? Nun, so glaube. Willst du ein Junge der Wahrheit sein? So forsche. That was a letter in Bonn, 11th of June, 1865. Here, Nietzsche explains the virtue of faith, whether religious or political, or indeed scientific faith, as methodologically infallible, highlighting a dialectically Kantian emphasis. Both Nietzsche and his sister were born into a parsonage. Their father, a Lutheran priest, died when both were quite young. And hence, the insight that Nietzsche recalled to Elizabeth, I continue from the letter, it's the faith that makes blessed. Accordingly, he says, every true faith is infallible. It accomplishes what the person holding the faith hopes to find in it, but that doesn't offer the slightest support for a proof of its objective truth. And that's the end of that quote. The focus Nietzsche chose for his own life as a disciple of truth rather than infallibility was the life of research, scientific inquiry, and he lived his life according to this choice. In the closing section of the first volume of Human, All Too Human, der Mensch, right, man, alone with himself, Nietzsche explores what he identifies as our convictions, as we maintain our beliefs, commitments, formative identifications, adding a reflection on science and method to highlight their close relation. I quote, if the individual had not been concerned with his truth, that's to say, with his being in the right, there would have been no methods of inquiry at all. And that's Human, All Too Human, section 634. In this way, the appeal to authority evolves into juridical process and methodical inquiries, what Nietzsche calls the spirit of science, in German, Geist der Wissenschaft, rests, he says, upon an insight into the procedures, and that's the next section, 635. That same methodological spirit of science is characterized not by a dedication to facts, but critique, what Nietzsche calls, I quote, an instinctive mistrust of devious thinking. That's Nietzsche. As opposed to the scientific spirit, Nietzsche distinguishes a more common proclivity for science the average person has. Nietzsche says, for them, it's enough to have discovered any hypothesis at all concerning any matter. Then they are at once on fire for it and believe the whole thing accomplished. To possess an opinion is to them the same thing as to become a fanatical adherent of it, and henceforth to lay it to their heart as a conviction. And the German is Überzeugung. Our term for this today is scientism. And scientism has perhaps never been more dangerous than today. In our current age of alt-truth and post-fact thinking, urging, as Steven Pinker does most recently, the wishful power of thinking optimistically, and not less, as in Pinker's case, which is also the tactic of a good deal of philosophy of technology, denying critique. Indeed, and whatever one's position on the value of critique, and Nietzsche, of course, thinks we should have vastly more of it than we do, calling for radicalization, as he does, of Immanuel Kant, it's plain that as we seek to be on guard against the swamp that is the skilla of so-called alt-truth, we cannot but, and all too easily, risk a still more precipitous fall into the Charybdis of scientism. How shall we avoid this dilemma? The poet, Robert Browning, counsels us in the spirit of New England transcendentalism, and I quote, "Here, work enough to watch the masterwork and catch hints of the proper craft, tricks of the tool's true play." That's from Browning's Rabbi Ben Ezra. If Nietzsche urges a bit more, he too underscores the importance of laboring only just enough to avoid the deadening of overwork. This would be one of Nietzsche's sweeter imperatives, such that one can still learn. Thus Nietzsche emphasizes insight into the very concept of science as such, as he highlights the question animating his first book on tragedy, and where he emphasizes consummate knowledge as advice for the scholar at the close of the first volume of Human All Too Human. At stake is a complete mastery of a science, less for its own sake than for the sake of insight into science as such. I quote Nietzsche, "Everyone now should have acquired a thorough knowledge of at least one science." This knowledge is methodologically valuable for Nietzsche, given this, I quote, "thorough knowledge of at least one science," that's Nietzsche, one, again the quote, "would know what's meant by method and procedure, and how vital it is to exercise the greatest circumspection." And we're still quoting again from Human All Too Human, section 635. The aphorism concludes with a warning contrast against popular enthusiasm for the idea of scientific genius. If the aphorisms to follow exceed our purpose today, it may be enough to cite Nietzsche's personal asseveration as a kind of snowball of fire. Elsewhere, he will use the language of a cold angel. In his untimely essay on history, Nietzsche speaks of cold demons, a complex self-reference to describe those like him as noble traitors to all things that can in any way be betrayed. The nobility in question is Aristotelian virtuosity, echoing the philosopher's claim of fealty and friendship to Plato, yielding, however, to the higher spirit of science, the love of truth. For Nietzsche, neither faith nor conviction, but what he calls freedom of mind, despite its loneliness, on the path of what Nietzsche beautifully calls the philosophy of the morning. And that is Human All Too Human, 638. The next section is simply titled Science. 2 decades ago, in the first lines of a book on Nietzsche and science, I reflected that thinking Nietzsche on science presupposes a change in philosophy of science. inasmuch as philosophy of science tends not to be critical of science per se, noting that critique is essential to what Nietzsche calls the spirit of science. Now, since then, almost all efforts to articulate a Nietzschean philosophy of science after my own effort, and there have been several such, all of them analytically minded, have managed to fail. So I think, and so others think, not in this case because, I would say, they don't raise the question of method, as Nietzsche does. In other words, they do not put the project of science in question, much less undertake to raise the question of science itself. If a good deal of philosophy of science, not just Nietzsche's philosophy of science, doesn't raise the question of science as such, as Nietzsche claims, and we'll come back to this, that he is the first to do, it's essential that it do so for the sake of science. The question of science, raising it, posing it, is a challenging one. Therefore, to raise it as such in a section of dawn, sometimes translated as daybreak, the German is Morgenröte, red of morning, entitled Investigators and Experimenters, Nietzsche emphasizes, I quote, "There are no scientific methods which alone lead to knowledge." This is a crucially rigorous and scientific emphasis, as Nietzsche learned this rigor from his teacher Friedrich Ritschl, as the value of non-exclusivity. There are many ways. Hence, when Nietzsche goes on to challenge the victory of method, qua method, Nietzsche is not writing against methodology any more than a friend of mine, who's died some years ago, Paul Feyerabend's Against Method, is a book opposed to scientific methodology. Here, we can also underscore the importance of the medieval preludes to modern science, as Pierre Duhem underlines these, as do many others, including Ivan Illich, who foregrounds the value of view of St. Victor's warning word concerning all the arts of learning: never look down on anything. Thus, that's a good piece of advice, Nietzsche's insight can teach us to value the plural form in the title of Ram Hare's little book, The Philosophies of Science. The Philosophies of Science. What's more, Nietzsche could almost seem to be summarizing the range and scope of Hans-Georg Gadamer's Truth and Method. Thus, Nietzsche writes, and although Gadamer hardly cites this passage from Daybreak, it illuminates Gadamer's account of experience, Erlebnis, in his reflections on historical science between Wilhelm Dilthey and Martin Heidegger's Count Jörg. And quoting Nietzsche, "We have to tackle things experimentally, now angry with them, and now kind, and be successively just, passionate and cold with them. One person addresses things as policeman, another as a father confessor, another as an inquisitive wanderer. Something can be wrung from things now with sympathy, now with force." And that's from section 432 in the Dawn, or Daybreak. At stake is a critique of pure methodology, endorsing variation on methods, a methodology of method, rigorously counterpoised against any claim to a scientific methodology that claims to be, and do not fail to catch Nietzsche's allusion to Hegel in the context of history, absolute. Key to Nietzsche's reflection is a juridical metaphor, also evident if we recall Gadamer's reference to legal deliberation and procedure, as Nietzsche takes the metaphor, as does Gadamer, despite his own Hegelianism, from Kant. Thus we read Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, where he speaks in his preface to the second edition of, I quote Immanuel Kant, "an appointed judge who compels the witness to answer questions which he himself has formulated." Failing such rigorously formal inquiry, we're left, as Kant twice repeats, with merely random groping. You can find one of those in the B edition of the preface XIV. The next section is a single word title: love. We'll come back to the constellation we've just mentioned with Kant and judgment. Here, however, returning to Nietzsche's earlier book, Human All Too Human, he argues for methodological testing, a deliberately experimental procedure, a device drawn from his own teacher, that is again Friedrich Ritschl, the philologist. Thus we read a methodological aphorism, Liebe als Kunstgriff, concerning love as investigative trick, as it's translated in the Stanford a new version, or tactical device. That is, as Reg Harlingdale translates, love as artifice. Nietzsche, I quote, "He who really wants to get to know something, be it a person, an event, or a book, does well to entertain it with all possible love, and to avert his eyes quickly from everything in it he finds inimical, repellent, false, and indeed to banish it from his mind, so that, for example, he allows the author of the book the longest start, and then, like one watching a race, desires with beating heart that he, the author, may reach his goal." And that's Human All Too Human, section 621. Nietzsche uses the artful allusion to the love that we hear in philology, the love of words, the same love that's also to be heard in the word philosophy, the love of wisdom, qua Kunstgriff, as he also characterizes the working function of the ascetic ideal in the same terms as a device, Kunstgriff, for the preservation of life, Genealogy of Morals 3, section 13, and not less as he reflects rather more specifically on love as the most refined technique that elevates Christianity above other religions. The term Kunstgriff also happens to be the sarcastic lever of Schopenhauer's heuristic dialectic, or art of spiritual fencing techniques. Schopenhauer counts 38 of these for being right, die Kunst, Recht zu behalten, the art of being right, and which can also be translated as trick, rather exactly in the fashion of the internet's "this weird trick helps you earn $1 million, lose weight, etc., advances technical efficacy or efficiency in the service of investigation. Schopenhauer calls these strategemata, ruses coinciding with the art of war. Strategy, of course, as this is all about method or technique, rather like Columbo's practiced informality as detective in engaging with his suspects, affording him, Columbo, the fruits of a certain familiarity along with the seeming confusion, which allows his suspects, as it were, to think they have his measure. Love, as a strategy, as stratagem, is the trick of interpretive or hermeneutic generosity. Thereby, one gives the object every benefit of the doubt, and one means it, for the moment, every support, even, as we just heard Nietzsche saying, to the extent of giving the author, the person we're investigating the event, a lift up or head start. The same generosity inspires Hugh of St. Victor's Didascalicon, and likewise animates, at least at the level of the word, the Latin is verbum, Thomas Aquinas' method of questioning. You can read Bernard Lonergan's book, Verbum, with the same title about exactly that, even against method in theology, his opponents. Similarly, hermeneutic empathy, adopted as scholarly stratagem, is also key to making a case in law. Love as artifice or technique or trick can also be deployed contra one's own convictions or prejudices. Here it's important to note that if love as such is not able to be commanded, summoned on demand, it can be strategized or feigned, like a fencer's feint. And such a practical tactic has its own proverbial expression: you catch more flies with honey than vinegar. And the same tactic is used with an interrogative edge in legal fiction and practice, bad cop, good cop, which also titles the German philologist Christian Benne's extraordinarily scholarly and insightful discussion of Nietzsche and philology and science, and you can Google that if you want. Nietzsche goes on to explain this idea of love as technical device, literally enough as he is speaking of his own discipline of philology, and which we may note as it illuminates what Gadamer means by openness to the other qua other, given our prejudices or convictions, as these block the possibility of encountering the other. Love, Nietzsche argues, offers a procedure for penetrating to the heart of the new thing. You have to love it, to the point that actually moves it. And precisely this is meant, he says, by getting to know it. And once again, I'm still quoting 621 in Human All Too Human. Here, it's useful to emphasize that Nietzsche is only repeating his own teacher Ritschl's original philological imperative, as we know these in retrospect, and I can quote a few of them, including the obvious no prejudices, but also the commandment here to, and I quote Ritschl, penetrate into the heart of the matter with your interpretation. And not less, we can add a few of Ritschl's related maxims. Never grow weary in trying to find ways. Don't go into criticism until you exhaust hermeneutics, until you exhaust interpretation. In this same canonically philological spirit, we recognize Gadamer's discussion of openness to the other qua other. By attending to this, we can bracket our prejudices while noting, as Nietzsche emphasizes, assuming one manages to get far enough to secure access, that, as Nietzsche adds, reason can afterwards make reservations, end quote. So you want to suspend judgment when you go to a new play. Nietzsche's point is that the suspension of critique in the service of hermeneutic generosity serves science. I quote again, that overestimation, that temporary suspension of the critical pendulum was just an artifice for luring forth the soul of a thing. You're only going to respond to a lover after all. As a temporary suspension of the critical attitude, the ruse of love allows the investigator to approach a thing on its own terms, recognizing that when we seek to understand, we have to bracket, without supposing for a moment that we can ultimately dispense with, our prejudices. We carry them with us no matter what, which Hans-Georg Gadamer articulates by way of Heidegger's four structures of understanding. For Gadamer, and I quote, all that's asked is that we remain open to the meaning of the other person or the text. But this openness always includes placing the other meaning in a relation with the whole of our own meanings or ourselves in relation to it. Thus, he continues, a person trying to understand a text is prepared for it to tell him something. End quote. The hermeneutic preparation for Gadamer includes the radical expectation of limit, corresponding to the important scientific experience, and I am thinking of Patrick Aidan-Heelan's experimental language of laboratory hermeneutics as so many what he called readable technologies, as Heelan argued that the lived practice of laboratory science requires learning how to read instruments, and therefore to read experimental results out of laboratory instruments, and displays a tacit knowledge of experiment and hermeneutic judgment. The scientific experiment, especially of a decisive or critical kind, can thus be analogous to what Gadamer describes as, and I quote Gadamer here, the familiar experience of being pulled up short by the text. As Gadamer explains this crucially decisive outcome of inquiry, I quote, either it doesn't yield any meaning, or its meaning isn't compatible with what we had expected, end quote. The next section is entitled Science and Method. Given the value of what Nietzsche calls love for both philological textual inquiry and not less hard laboratory science, thus the reference to Heelan's hermeneutic philosophy of readable technologies, we cannot be surprised to note that the compound of science and method, often highlighted with the determinate article as the scientific method, are seductive ideals. More rigorously, qua discussion of methodology, qua principles guiding specific research practices, involves the meta-question of method as such. For the same reason, methodology is central to philosophy of science. The language of X and Y as such, which would remind us of Kant a bit, the an sich, as the Kant phraseology has it, goes back to Kant's own critical project, which, as he writes in the Critique of Pure Reason, is all about what has and what has not, to use Kant's phraseology, entered upon the secure path of a science. Just in contrast to, again to quote Kant, once again, merely random groping, and that's B, and that would be section 17 in the preface. For Kant, the revolutionary method tout court consists precisely, granting Hume's skepticism, in recognizing what pure reason alone of itself can know, in its limits, on its terms, as applied or limited to sense experience. For Kant, I quote, reason has insight only into that which it produces after a plan of its own, and that it must not allow itself to be kept, as it were, in nature's leading strings. The word for Kant is am Leitbande gingen lassen, but must itself show the way, with principles of judgment based upon fixed laws, constraining nature to give answer to questions of reason's own determining. And that's section 13 of the preface in the B edition. Kant, as we recall, reminds us, to quote further, that reason must approach nature in order to be taught by it. Yet, as Kant emphasizes, precisely not in the fashion of naive observation, or, as he says, I quote him, as a pupil who listens to everything that the teacher chooses to say, but just in the manner of a juridical investigation, again to quote Kant, as an appointed judge, we repeat the quote, who compels the witness to answer questions which he himself has formulated. That's the same section in the preface of the B edition. Kant argues that reason adopt rational prescription as its strength, learning from nature alone, excluding fictitious ascriptions, while adopting, he says, as its guide in so seeking that which it itself has put into nature. That's section 14 of the B edition. Sounds suspiciously like Nietzsche. With the famous distinction between noumenal and phenomenal, Kant focuses on the revelation of the phenomenal. This is the quote, objects conform to our knowledge. That is, as Kant summarizes, what he names his new method of thought, namely, that we can know a priori of things only what we ourselves put into them. Again, that's section 18 in the B edition of the preface. Kant's first critique is thus a contribution to pure methodology. A treatise, as Kant says, I quote, on the method, not a system of the science itself. And that's the same locus in the preface. Nietzsche takes his own reflections on method from this same critical project, linked to what Nietzsche describes as the very question of science itself, as Nietzsche writes in his own preface to the second edition of The Birth of Tragedy, pointing to the necessity of raising the question of science as a question. That's Nietzsche's formulation, which question, he tells us, he had been the very first to raise as such. Birth of Tragedy, section 2 of the preface. Nietzsche's critical project thus goes further than Kant, not merely because Nietzsche says it does, but to the extent that in addition to the witness, recall Kant's example of the witness in the dock, that is to say, in this case, nature as such, in the case of natural science, or the text, as in the case of Nietzsche's inquiry into Homer, or Archilochus, or Pindar, all these ancient philological texts, Nietzsche advocates that we put science itself in question, thus raising the question of method and science. And I come to the next section. Vivisection and death. On the grey science or method in philology. Nietzsche writes, whoever wants to dissect must kill, however, only in order that it may be better known, better judged, better lived, not in order that all the world dissect. which is from Human Ulterium, the section, the later part of after Volume 2, entitled The Wanderer and His Shadow, section 19, and I present that in German. Wer Arbeit ziehen will, muss töten. Jedoch nur damit besser gewusst, besser geurteilt, besser gelebt werde, nicht damit alle Welt seziere. Okay. Nietzsche was fond of a little parable to illustrate the fate of the expert in his scientific field, that is, the philologist, on the hunt for tiny scraps of text, comparing and correcting these. Nietzsche offered an analogy to a good bourgeois man who, having inherited a painting in need of repair, learned to repair it, and discovering that he had a talent for making such repairs, went on to repair the paintings of his neighbors and acquaintances as well. After engaging in this occupation for years, he gets the rare opportunity to visit a famous museum. But, and this is the moral of the story, our good man, as Nietzsche calls him, finds upon arriving there that he's unable to enjoy the paintings as all he sees when he looks at them are patches that need repair. This practitioner's eye or liability applies to any scientist, anyone with a clinical or practical occupation. And this includes teaching as much as it includes nursing and Nietzsche's own discipline of classical philology. Here in question is Nietzsche's complicated suggestion that what characterized his 19th century, that was the title of this lecture, the same century which makes the 20th and arguably even the 21st century possible, is less the victory of science as such, but, as we already quoted, contends the victory of scientific method over science. At issue here is a reflection on methodology. Thus, Nietzsche writes, "It will do to consider science as an attempt to humanize things as faithfully as possible. As we describe things and thereafter one another, we learn how to describe ourselves more and more precisely." That's from the Gay Science, section 112. Nietzsche's thinking on science, particularly as it concerns the inductive problem of causality, parallels Hume's more famous critique of causality, and thus Karl Jaspers, himself a physician and philosopher, articulates what we may call Nietzsche's problem of science in terms of scientific methodology, using explicitly Kantian, some would say neo-Kantian language. This isn't to be taken generically, as if such a scientific methodology could just as well refer to either Kant or Burckhardt, or to making tea or starting a microbrewery. And there is, of course, the science of beer, as Hume will also tell us, of tasting or judging wine. Thus, although his own field of classics continues to refuse to acknowledge him, I regard Nietzsche, as Heidegger names Hölderlin a poet's poet, as a philologist's philologist. To this extent that Nietzsche, who tells us about investigative tactics for reading a text or discovering the metrical relations of antique lyric and tragedy, and thus of Greek prosody, how you pronounce Greek as such, did not stumble into his scientific field by want of anything better to do, or as a kind of accident, as Hugh Lloyd-Jones has made this point. Not that it's been heard, echoed by a number of people, Victor Porschel, Rudolf Rein in Italy, Gerardo Ugolini, among a number of others, including Jonathan Barnes. Thus, Christian Benne, we already cited him, can remind us that by the time Nietzsche took his early retirement from his position in Basel, one might count 21 years in total, I'm quoting Benne, if one counts as Benne counts, doubling the lawyer James Q. Whitman's minimum of a decade. He's at Yale, as Whitman counts Nietzsche's classical engagement in his essay on, this is Whitman's essay on Nietzsche and the magisterial tradition. It's a good essay worth looking up. Were we inclined, as a last we are not likely to be, and we unfortunately therefore continue to miss the point after all this time, this would correspond, if we wanted to do this math, as Benne tells us, to more than half of what turned out to be Nietzsche's conscious intellectual life. Meaning that Nietzsche, I quote Benne, dedicated the greater part of every day to to philology, to classical philology. And this Nietzsche did in precisely the same magisterial tradition that Whitman underscores. I say this because it's central to the point to note both the scholarly consummation as well as the disciplinary exclusion of that same field, which continues to exclude Nietzsche, which Whitman summarizes by pointing importantly, and as I've also sought to do, to the most powerful tactic in scholarship. That's non-mention, non-citation, silence. One is not refuted by one's fellow scholars, one is simply ignored. Nevertheless, the scholar thus ignored, Nietzsche, cannot be understood apart from classics, apart from that same tradition of classical philology, and which also happens to inform his understanding of and his critique of what he called scientific method. Jaspers, whom we've already mentioned, tells us that along with the usual cadre of philological students and scholars, I quote Jaspers, Ritschl's classical philology seminar was also visited by non-philologists, including even numerous medical men who participated in it with a view to learning method, the art of distinguishing the real from the unreal, the factual from the fictitious, demonstrable knowledge from mere opinions, and objective certainty from subjective preference." End quote. Elsewhere, I discuss the relevance of this same tradition of philology, that's to say, for the development of evolutionary theory in biology. But here it's enough to recall once again that Ritschl was Nietzsche's teacher. Thus, Jaspers echoes a focus that inspired Heidegger's own methodic questions concerning truth and science, emphasizing the dangers at stake, just as Kant had already done in the 18th century, at once speaking influentially of reason embarking on dangerous seas. That's the language. Just as Nietzsche invoked the same peripheral danger in his first book, where reason, as Nietzsche argues, can go aground, biting itself in its own tail, as Nietzsche writes. At the end of his life, Heidegger would claim that Nietzsche had broken him, which means that there is danger on many levels here, not merely the easy and astonishingly wrong on every level assessment that Nietzsche knew no science, as many otherwise responsible authors who write on Nietzsche and science insist. To explain, we may recall in homage to my teacher and best of friends, the late David B. Allison, echoing the title of his essay, I quote, "Nietzsche knows no noumenon." In 2001 book, Allison's Reading the New Nietzsche, in a friendly footnote, he refers readers interested in Nietzsche and science to my own book, Nietzsche's Philosophy of Science. Now, I am grateful for any footnote. As Paul Ricoeur says, the goal of any scholar is to become a footnote. But David's sensibility was faint. He was a good friend, so I'm allowed to say that. Seeing as he saw, as Kleist saw with respect to Kant, as Nietzsche reflects on this in his essay on Schopenhauer, as this same insight arguably also broke Heidegger on his own being question. Supposing that what Nietzsche writes about science is true, what follows for science? What remains in the wake of such critique? Many people call this postmodern and lay it at the feet of a Derrida or a Lyotard, or depending on their taste, a Foucault or Deleuze, or even, which allows them to get back to the traditional narrative, Simondon. For his own part, Nietzsche knew the limitations of being modern, being in the grip of scientific method at its best, because he suffered from just this circumstance. And what it blocked was not merely his own career, but, as he argued, the advance of his discipline as such. As philologist, Nietzsche invoked what he called the battle of methodologies, that is, the Methodenstreit between careful text philology, which he learned from Ritschl, a precise and comparative reading of sources in both theology and classics, as opposed to a focus on history and archaeology, in order to get to ancient culture itself. That would be Sachphilologia. Today, many scholars of ancient Greece and Rome regard knowing the language itself as cheap ontic stuff. You don't really need it. Ancillary to their work in their critical attention, not on hermeneutics, but antiquity itself, die Sache selbst. Text philology, Textphilologia, is limited, as Nietzsche's story about repairing paintings tells us, precisely because it inevitably leads one to miss the broader context. You can't see the painting, you just see the patches. Sachphilologia, on the other hand, leaves one vulnerable to overlooking details, even when other scholars spell them out. Nietzsche himself was a child of both traditions, a student of Ritschl, the best of the antiquarian or text philologists, and of Otto Jahn, who specialized in monumental philology. And if Nietzsche was attuned to elements of both traditions, his text-based discoveries fell between the cracks, owing to a certain methodic blindness on the part not only of his own teacher Ritschl, but also his more culturally oriented peers who lacked both the needed precision and generosity, remember the love trick, to see Nietzsche's project on his own terms. For this reason, Nietzsche's first book wasn't read as a companion to his studies of quantitational rhythm or lyric, which he also never published, namely his discovery of the musical spirit of Greek as a temporal system of tones, tones in time, expressed in his public lectures and published books, both The Birth of Tragedy and The Gay Science, arguing the tragedy was literally sung in the courtly tradition of die Meistersinger, and like grand opera, contemporary to this day. I have long been making this case, but most scholars then and now simply assume that Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy was simply written in the spirit of an enthusiasm for Wagner. Hence, nearly 75 years after its first publication, the classicist Gerald Elser describes Nietzsche's account of tragedy as born from the so-called, this is a quote, goat song or satyr dance as a dissonant one, end quote, even as Elser reflects that it's an association with Dionysus and satyrs would, I quote Elser, be shared with Aristotle himself. Here we add that it's not for nothing, just to get technical about it, that the Olms reprint edition of the influential philological critique of Nietzsche's book, as edited by Carlfried Gründer, is titled Der Streit Nietzsches Gebot zur Tragödie, the battle around or concerning Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy. This conflict concerned more than Willamowitsch's attack, because what was at stake was nothing less than the very same question of science as a question. Thus, the same leading scholar, that would be Hermann Usener, who had, this is important, originally hoped to draft Nietzsche, a Diogenes Laertius scholar of the very first rank, to collaborate with the younger Aristotle and Theophrastus expert Hermann Diels to prepare what subsequently became Diels's canonical Die Vorsokratiker, which we know with their emendations as Kirk-Raven and now Schofield's The Pre-Socratic Philosophers. Usener, despite his original faith in Nietzsche's scholarly scientific promise, pronounced Nietzsche wissenschaftlich tot, scientifically dead, as Nietzsche repeats this reported judgment in a letter to Rode. Once again, scientifically dead, as researcher in the wake of his first book. If he wrote that book, he's finished. If Nietzsche perhaps overstated Usener's judgment, as Whitman, among others, have contended, there are reports that suggest that Usener was rather more restrained, at least at the time of Nietzsche's report when he wrote his letters about it. What's undeniable is that Nietzsche himself, very personally, but also in terms of the reception of his work, would be a casualty of the battle of and between methodologies. Here, too, we may note the key reference to battle that begins Nietzsche's retrospective reflection on his first book, attempt at a self-critique. When it comes to Nietzsche's question of science, as we might pose this question today, mainstream philosophy of science, a field that is by definition analytic, has not tended to engage either Nietzsche or, this is equal opportunity disengagement, the so-called postmodernists. This disinclination characterizes the fallout, as we may speak of it, of Sokol's so-called hoax, which Sokol himself crafted as an attack on postmodern science, not merely in the guise of Jacques Derrida or Sarah Kaufmann, say, but particularly Sokal wrote essay after essay against Bruno Latour. In nursing philosophy, for one example, this matters. When it comes to reading Jean Watson on Nietzsche, whether the postmodernists in question are taken to be Foucault or Lyotard, Deleuze or Derrida. For Latour, let it be noted, is himself sui generis, and his critical philosophical ship, including the Parliament of Things, and most recently his reflections on ecology and climate, that's to say Gaia, is still sailing and going strong. But saying this, it's crucial at the same time, in the case of the philosophy of science, to note that while Latour's erstwhile co-travelers, the Edinburgh theorists of the strong programme in sociology, seem to have gone to ground on the Scottish shoals of the problem of induction. Perhaps this is only fair, as those dangerous seas were first mapped out by David Hume. If, as we already saw, just noting it previously above, Nietzsche emphasizes that there is and can be no science without method, he urged, we began with this, that one learn method. But Nietzsche doesn't endorse method for the sake of method, but, and much rather, method for the sake of science. In other words, method is precisely a device, an artifice. We remember his phrase, Kunstgriff. Thus, we can finally understand Nietzsche's insight that method not only does not make science, but taken to extremes, can destroy science. For this reason, his third untimely meditation, Schopenhauer as Educator, and elsewhere I highlight a beautiful parallel with that other reader of Schopenhauer, Ludwig Wittgenstein. Nietzsche offers a classificatory schema of the scholar as such, detailing the reasons one might have for going into academia to begin with. Nietzsche counts off 12 types, 12 of them, but almost like Jordan Peterson, but begins with a number of key distinctions so that his total count may be assessed at closer to 16 different scholarly typologies, classified according to motivation, what Pierre Bourdieu called habitus, dedicating a special place to the drive for greed and personal profit. Thus, Nietzsche points out that the state itself pays a few select individuals, that'd be the professors, to practice philosophy for money in Basel. It's a state appointment to be professor. And here we may recall that Nietzsche, not unlike the Scottish philosopher David Hume, was a reader of Lucian, the 2nd century Syrian author, and his sardonic, I titled, give the title you can find in the Loeb edition, Philosophies for Sale. And he goes on to point out that officially employed philosophers cannot, by definition, this is also a point that Plato makes, be philosophers. We can read this, if we like, as inspiration for Max Weber's Wissenschaft als Beruf, science as vocation, as Nietzsche goes on to argue that pursuit of science, or as we can call it scholarship if we like, for the sake of a career or for the sake of earning a living, is an oxymoron. The solution isn't privately funded science research, because that would be the same thing, similarly challenged. Think of Google, or still think of biotech. Nietzsche's reasons for making this claim are classical ones, hence the reference to Lucian goes way back, 2nd century AD. Thus, in his 19th century AD, Nietzsche makes the case he had already argued against Hegel and the civic or political or market proof of success in the second untimely meditation, that anyone who pursues research for the sake of money cannot but be given over to that motive. You do it for money, you do it for money. Thus one does the kind of research that allows one to get grants, and so on. A theme repeated in the last century, that's the point of Max Weber, both science as vocation and politics as vocation. And the next section is entitled, The Victory of Scientific Method over Science. In Jean Watson's 1994 chapter, Poeticizing as Truth Through Language, Robert Bernasconi's lovely reflections on the possibilities for science, on the terms of Gadamer's own methodological reflections on truth and method, are quoted from his introduction to Gadamer's essay, The relevance of the beautiful, which Bernasconi himself edits. Bernasconi repeats Gadamer's citation of Nietzsche's challenge to the methodological achievements of the 19th century, forming the ideal of science in the current era. Again, we quote, "It is not the victory of science that distinguishes our 19th century, but the victory of scientific method over science." In this talk, I've been at pains to underline that Nietzsche is not endorsing the victory of scientific method over science, but the specific role and risks of method. I went on to note that Max Weber sought to emphasize a similar point in his Science as Vocation lecture, but then added, and this may have gone by very quickly, that it would not be until my old friend Paul Feyerabend with his singular book Against Method that one might begin to understand the full force of Nietzsche's challenge as philosophy of science. Yet to this day, a certain Methodenstreit continues to characterize philosophy of science proper. And what's certain is that Feyerabend has yet to garner an unimpeachable assessment of his own legacy, or even, and this is telling, a careful biography, which would perforce have to assume the former, as has been done in the case, say, of Thomas Kuhn, by Steve Fuller, who also spoke with me here in this studio. I argue that a Nietzschean philosophy of science is not merely a matter of adding a certain kind of methodology, say, let's call it genealogy, as some scholars do, because then you've leapt over Nietzsche to get to Deleuze, or Foucault as you prefer, nor indeed a certain emphasis on naturalism, if one likes that word, or perspectivism, if one prefers to speak that way, but rather and nothing less than undertaking the very effort of questioning, raising, as Nietzsche suggests, the question of science as a question. To begin to do this is already to alter the nature of philosophy of science, and this kind of alteration is needed for a thinker like Nietzsche, who challenged distinctions typically made between truth and lie, and who began his human, all too human, with a section entitled Chemistry of Concepts and Sensations. Titles like this, which would, among other things, inspire the chemist Alvin Mittasch to write one of the first books on Nietzsche's understanding of science by asking, and I quote, "How can something originate in its opposite? For example, rationality in irrationality, the sentient in the dead, logic in unlogic, disinterested contemplation in covetous desire, altruism in egoism, truth in error." It's the first section of Human, All Too Human. This sentence goes through the entire Kantian register of the sciences, including all three critiques. Nietzsche goes further still, declaring that facts are exactly what there is not, only interpretation, as he writes in his later Nachlass. Just where it's possible to do Foucault, as Gavin Kendall and Gary Wickham helpfully illustrate in their methodological overview using Foucault's methods, and just where it can be unsettling to read Nietzsche through Hölderlin, or even, and more simply, via Shakespeare, in light of Nietzsche's final physical collapse, as Polonius says of Hamlet, "Though this be madness, yet there is method in't." We need to guard against reducing Nietzsche to today's postmodern turn, today's alt-truth, as dangerous as co-opting Nietzsche for transhumanism. The problem for Nietzsche of the victory of method over science is that it sacrifices science itself. To raise the question of science as a question is a patent methodological challenge. Yet, how is it to be put into practice? How do we do it? The motivation is both obvious and necessary. Questioning science is science. It is incumbent upon science to ask what science, to be science, should be. The corollary is also clear. Unquestioned science, uncritical science, unexamined science is simply not science. It's dogma. Thus, it can seem simpler and even more scientific to assume, quote, "the ritual of method," to borrow Jean Watson's characterization of it, suggesting the aspect or appearance or look of the experiment conducted, as she writes, in a value-free context. Now, dogmatism has a great deal of momentum owing to a long tradition on its side, and it's convenient to boot. Jean Watson helpfully summarizes the contrast between postmodern and modern in a hermeneutic mode. As she says, first, we can admit that it's never possible to know another's experience. Even though we may intuit it and vicariously identify with it, it remains uniquely other, end quote. But it's her second point that highlights the value of methodological reflection. I quote again, second, we can find it possible to grasp the other's experience by becoming better acquainted with how we encounter it as researcher, as clinician, and so on. That's the end of the quote. The problem, as we know in the years since 1994, is that many refuse the terminology of the postmodern, perhaps today more than ever. And yet, these same insights have not been outstripped. The takeaway for us, as it seemed to Nietzsche, and as it can seem to us today, is that questioning science, which Nietzsche explicates as doubting more radically than Descartes, would be essential for any possible science deserving of the name, and that language is Kantian, as Nietzsche also sought to take Kant's own critique more critically than Kant himself had done. Can we not similarly radicalize Nietzsche, critique Nietzsche's critique? Is not the project of putting science in question the denial of science? Shouldn't we strive for the old ideal of objectivity, value-free judgments, which seemingly automatically convert to an unquestioning approach to an unquestioning science, a faithful approach to the facts? Is this not a legacy of the realist approach to nature, even if Nietzsche can't help teasing a bit? I quote him, "You call yourself realists, and hint that the world really is the way it appears to you, as if reality stood unveiled before you only, and you yourselves were perhaps the best part of it. Oh, you beloved images of Saiz." That's the Gay Science, section 57. We can skip the fairly salacious commentary on Saiz, important, we'll get back to that. But Pierre Hadot writes an entire book, including Nietzsche's allusions to Schiller and to Goethe, as if to gloss this very line with its allusions to the veils of Isis. That'd be Saiz again, the subtitle of Hadot's book of the same title, translated into English in 2008 as an essay on the history of the idea of nature. That is, representing Isis, or Saiz, qua nature as such, the goddess of truth, as object of natural science. Nietzsche, borrowing the animating influence of what his friend Rode speaks of to describe Pythagoras as grand master of suspicion, and we'll hear this again when we get to Ricoeur, turns the question against the complex motivations of the researcher himself, qua exposed or revealed. Thus, the salacious undercurrent isn't exactly gratuitous. Nietzsche writes, "In your unveiled state, are not even you still very passionate and dark creatures compared to a fish, and still far too similar to an artist in love? And what is reality for an artist in love? You're still burdened with those estimates of things that have their origins in the passions and loves of former centuries. Your sobriety still contains a secret and inextinguishable drunkenness. Your love of reality, for example. Oh, that's a primeval love." And Nietzsche puts love in quotation marks. Section 57, Gay Science. Nietzsche continues to indite the projective contribution that the observer cannot help making with every glance he takes, as he takes himself to see what is objectively as it is. In reality, I quote Nietzsche, "that mountain there, that cloud there, what's real in that? Subtract the phantasm and every human contribution from it, my sober friends, if you can. If you can forget your descent, your past, your training, all of your humanity and animality." It's the same section in the Gay Science. Recall that we earlier noted that Nietzsche himself follows Kant's phenomenological methodology, proposing a focused design for experimental research by constraining the results that can be given. In the spirit of this phenomenological methodology, Nietzsche ultimately suggests that one set a question mark after oneself as inquirer or researcher, essential but famously difficult. the suggestion exceeds the old recommendation dating back to the oracle at Delphi, and ever valuable as caveat for those who consult oracles, gnothe se auton in the Greek, know thyself. At issue for Nietzsche, who raises the question of science as a question, is the question of what science seeks. The scholar who identifies himself or herself with his or her scientific activities can be so absorbed that he or she will not only have failed to question science, but have failed to question the reasons for their own involvement in that same field. We can recall Nietzsche's estimation that 99, as he says, out of 100, that's a quote, classical scholars didn't belong in the discipline, and that leaves a painful 1% that did. This makes Nietzsche's phenomenological hermeneutic perhaps unique. Most scholars have failed to question themselves. As Nietzsche writes in his preface to On the Genealogy of Morals, I quote, "We are unknown to ourselves, we human beings of knowledge, and with good reason. We've never sought ourselves. How could it ever happen that we should ever find ourselves?" Now, this same point is something that we want to skip ahead for. It's a difficult question. We, of course, get in our way. We, of course, are necessarily strangers to ourselves, to quote Nietzsche. We have to misunderstand ourselves, this self-obstruction, a circumstance leading, which is the downside of it, to today's well-known imposter syndrome, as well as burnout syndrome, and somewhat more prosaically, garden variety, boredom. This alone makes Nietzsche's phenomenological hermeneutic perhaps unique, just to the extent that most scholars have failed to question themselves. If we did, we might conclude that imposter syndrome was just the beginning of self-knowledge. As Nietzsche writes in his preface to On the Genealogy of Morals, once again, we are unknown to ourselves, we human beings of knowledge, and with good reason. And this is where he comes again to say that because we've never sought ourselves, we can't find ourselves because we don't look. To conclude then, recall the close of Nietzsche's Genealogy, where he cites the cult of the assassins, who themselves draw the fullest consequences from the report of the death of God, nihilism as code. Nothing is true, everything is permitted. That's the third section of the Genealogy of Morals, section 23. In an era of Trump and media manipulation like nobody's business in our digital era, where we can even hack election results, it's worth attending to the implications of such a nihilist, nothing is true, worldview. And thinking of methodology, it's still more useful to attend to Nietzsche's argument that the scientists contend toward dogmatism. Quoting Nietzsche, in their faith in truth, they are more rigid and unconditional than anyone. That's section 24 in the Genealogy. Owing to such a scientific preference for dogmatism, scientists who read philosophy and philosophers of science alike were disconcerted by Feyerabend's against method, or indeed Feyerabend's science in a free society, just as many medical professionals, nurses and physicians alike, were discomfited by Ivan Illich's challenges in his medical nemesis, just as from an anthropologist or ethnographic perspective, scholars were unsettled by Bruno Latour's We've Never Been Modern, or even more so by Latour's biography of an investigation. These thinkers raise methodological questions contra method for the sake of science. Today's nostalgia for pre-post-truth thus dates from Nietzsche's 19th century. I quote him, that desire to halt before the factual, the factum brutum, that fatalism of petit fait, ce petit fatalisme, as I call it, through which French science, note that Nietzsche makes that as a special distinction in his day, tries to establish a sort of moral superiority over German science. That'd be German science in Nietzsche's day. I conclude here, just where it's an entirely new theme, to ask what it might mean to speak of frustrating oneself before the facts, genuflecting before the facts. What's certain is that in an alt-truth, post-fact era, we can suppose we already know the answer. But for Nietzsche, methodologically, the conviction that one knows the answer in advance is always the problem when it comes to science. And I thank you for your attention.